The 1990s was a very interesting decade for music, where underground music started to rise to prominence in many different ways. Grunge became popular in the early 90s with bands like Nirvana and Soundgarden bringing a sound that broke up the hair metal and glam rock dominance of the 80s. And that allowed for a new wave of artists to break through without having to wear tight pants, makeup, or even have long hair. The music reflected the style and the scene of the musicians coming up at this time. Punk rock music also rose to prominence with the likes of Green Day and The Offspring making big splashes that led to punk rock finally becoming one of the most popular rock genres. Then something else happened. Right around the same time, another underground scene was becoming more popular, and it was due to a cultural shift where comic books, Dungeons and Dragons, and other fringe cultural relics started to become more widely accepted. Science fiction and fantasy books, TV shows, and movies were becoming more and more prevalent, and it became a bit more cool to not be the cool kids. Hell, even ska became popular, and that's when band nerds got to live like rock stars while playing trumpet or trombone. During this time, there was also a little-known band called Weezer that put out a completely unassuming self-titled album that just showed the four band members in plain clothes against a solid blue backdrop. The album became known as the Blue Album, and with the popularity of this album, rock music would never be the same again. On the 30th anniversary of Weezer's debut self-titled album known as the Blue Album, I was sent a text message from one of my oldest friends, Ryan, who is a musician who sings the songs you hear at the beginning and end of each of these podcast episodes. He knows I grew up a huge Weezer fan, and he sent me this message. Quote, I just want to say in honor of the 30th anniversary of Weezer's Blue Album that if you are really honest with yourself and take your personal nostalgia out of the equation, that the album really isn't that good. I'm listening to it right now, and it's kind of shitty, and so is that band as a whole. F you and fuck Friday. So in response to that, I had to get some reinforcements to really put this man in his place. So that's why I brought in my good buddy, S.W. Lauden, author, editor of the Generation Blue Project, which in conjunction with Big Stir Records and Spider Pop Records is a multimedia project that pairs the rock history retrospective retelling of the 90s LA geek rock scene in a book that also features members of the bands who lived and played during this time, combined with a vinyl compilation album that includes music from the bands that rose from the wake of the newly formed geek rock scene, such as Shufflepuck, Supersport, 2000, Nerf Herder, Ozma, and the band he played drums in at the time, Rydell High. Also, I have with me Rod Cervera, musician and producer and engineer who played in Supersport 2000 and helped Matt Sharp kickstart the Rentals. He was actually on the Return of the Rentals album. He also helped produce Weezer's Maladroit album with the band and has worked on various other projects over the years. So thank you guys. Welcome. And thanks for coming on and helping me set my friend straight.
Yeah. Thanks, Isaac. I really appreciate you having me back on the show and giving me a reason to have Rod be able to tell his stories as well.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting one because I don't like to just, sit there and go online and start an internet beef competition, right? Where you're just like, oh, you're stupid. Let's actually talk about it. Let's debate it. Let's open it up to with people who are actually there and why this actually matters. And obviously for anybody who's watching, some of the bands we're going to talk about today, Weezer, Rentals, so on and so forth, different levels of notoriety. But if you go back and listen to this music, like I have with the Generation Blue Project, the music's really, really good. Like that whole compilation, the album, the vinyl, is really good. I'm going to buy that plus the book, and we'll leave a link to the in the description below as well to buy it. But it's really good. And then the playlist that you sent me that has like kind of the extended version where it has like more and more songs with other bands, Steve. It's really, really good. I mean, I don't think there's maybe like 2 songs on there where like, whatever. But then the rest, and there's like 50 songs on that. And I was like, holy shit, these are all really good.
Thanks for saying that. This started off primarily as a book project. I was going to just write a book about geek rock. And I, was shopping that to publishers and had some interest. But the more interest I got, the more I was like, man, I don't know if I really want to write a book about geek rock all up. So I had to kind of ask myself what I wanted to write. And really it was me wanting to tell the stories of that scene that Rod and I were part of in Hollywood in the 90s, because, some of it might be looking back through rose-colored glasses, but it's a pretty magical time when there were all these like-minded bands and there was all this camaraderie and all these people with kind of shared dreams. Everybody had their own passions and own vision for what they wanted to do with their music. But we would play these stacked bills with each other. Everybody was helping each other out. So many of us were jumping from band to band. But I felt like a lot of that music got lost to time. And one of my favorite quotes that I've heard about this compilation so far is, it's sort of like nuggets for 90s geek rock, meaning there are all these songs. If you like Weezer and if you like the Rentals, you'll probably like these songs as well. The difference being these songs were being created in real time right along with the music of Weezer and the Rentals. And so it's got a slightly different perspective to it. But yeah, once the compilation came into the equation, I knew we had something pretty special.
Yeah. So let's kind of dive in, obviously, and we'll talk more about the project and stuff like that. And I got tons of questions about that. But let's kind of talk about this because I want to, I'm not the kind of guy who actually really does care about nostalgia. I was actually thinking about writing a song called like Nostalgia Sucks or something, because it's like, I like to really focus on what's happening now because bands playing now are really good. Sure. Like I still listening to old music, but it's so hard to even like think about all the old music when I'm like, there's so much good music I can still listen to. It's happening right now. Whereas most people are like, I only want to hear classic music or stuff that I grew up on. Right. But I do remember taking road trips from Montana to Oregon because my parents were divorced when I was like 5. So we moved out to Oregon. My mom lived in North Dakota. The rest of our family lived in Montana. But I remember taking this 900-mile trip, in the summers during the 90s and constantly blasting the Blue Album, especially that third track, The World Has Turned and Left Me Here, feeling exactly like this is what it's like being, in a car driving 900 miles. And my dad had this puke green 1979 Plymouth Fury, which is like a cop car that he affectionately called the Pickle. So like I'm sitting in the back of this thing, we're listening to this music, and I've got my, at the time, the little Walkman or Discman on, right, playing the album. And I'm just like thinking like, man, this actually is music that speaks to me. And it's one of those albums that you listen to now, you can't help but think like, if you listen to this album, you'll remember some point in your life that matches this album to that moment in your life. Do you guys ever have that feeling with the music at that time as well? Obviously you played in a lot of these shows, so you probably have memories of that stuff as well.
Oh yeah. I mean, recently I started kind of listening to some of this music again. I just hadn't for a while, and it did take me right back to that time. Not only these bands, but other bands that were in the early 90s that were, I was a big fan of the band Lush, for example, and I was listening to them the other day, and it just brought me right back to that. Somehow it's still, bands that were like that were still influencing, me at the time, and it just brings me right back. And certainly hearing the songs from the compilation brings me back to that time.
Yeah, I mean, I have really specific memories of the Blue Album. Like Rod, I grew up in LA, and I went to a lot of shows all over Southern California, all throughout high school. Like, I was just remembering the other day that I got a fake ID specifically so I could go see a garage punk band called the Primates in Hollywood at a Greg Shaw club, right? The guy who started Bomp. And I was like, I really want to see this band because they went to my high school. And then that fake ID got me into all kinds of shows all over the place. And I was pretty tuned into the local music scene around LA and Hollywood. But in 92, I graduated from college and I moved to Europe for 18 months. That was the exact 18 months that Weezer happened. So I get back, and my buddy Mike Randall from the band Baby Lemonade, who's in the book and on the comp, he was working at a record store in Santa Monica, and I walked through the door. I haven't seen the guy in almost 2 years. And he's like, Steve. And he's like, you got to hear this. You're the first guy I thought of when I heard this album. And he played Undone. And he was right. I flipped for it. I was like, what happened in LA while I was gone? And so at the time I was playing in a hardcore punk band in Hermosa Beach called the Fish Sticks. And the logo was the Black Flag logo, but it was Fish Sticks instead. And then I was also playing in an instrumental surf punk band called Bookmobile. And that's the area I grew up in. So I was really just happy playing these dive bars and keg parties down by the beach. It was like a lot of fun. And my buddy Marco from Santa Barbara, who played in the band Popsicle, called me and said, hey, there's this band in Hollywood that needs a drummer. And I had seen this band. They were called Lunchbox. And I was like, man, I don't want to drive up to Hollywood 4 or 5 nights a week and be in some band that's like trying to get signed. Like, I just want to like hang out at keggers and get drunk. And he talked me into
Classic
it.
Hollywood cliche, right?
Yeah, right. You know, it was a very different world. Like, the most I had dreamed of up to that point was like, maybe one day I can be on SST. And these guys were all like, let's get major label deals, right? It was a very different world we were coming from. So I tried out for this band. I got in. They changed their name to Rydell High. And sort of unwittingly, like, it took me a little while to figure out that these guys were all connected to Weezer. Like, Kevin Rydell, the lead singer of my band, grew up playing heavy metal in Connecticut with Weezer, and their band Avant Garde actually moved from Connecticut to LA to take advantage of the hair metal scene in like 89, 90. And so this scene that I was like blown away that I had missed, I suddenly got to be part of and meet people like Rod and people like Jason Cropper from the band Chopper One. And Jason was also the original guitarist in Weezer, right? And Shufflepuck, who lived in the Amherst house with Weezer and would play shows with Weezer, or Campfire Girls, all the bands on the comp. I found my way into the scene totally by accident, but I was a fan of the Blue Album first. And you know, look, it's one of those records that has haters, you know, and that's fine. You don't have to like everything. But I do find that like the Blue Album is this dividing line for musical tastes. I think if you don't like it, you're missing something.
If you don't like it, I don't like you.
Not only is my romantic association with, right, that's it, we're done. I'm ending this interview. I don't just have a romantic association for it. I went to the 30th anniversary show here in LA to see Weezer perform this record to 500 people in a small club. And everybody was singing every word of that song back to them at full volume, right? It was magical. So if you like this record, you definitely have to have some sort of attachment to what it means. And I think that the influence it's had on alternative rock is completely undeniable.
I agree. And, you know, I was, like I said, I think you guys might be 8 to 10, maybe 12 years older than me. So I was kind of coming up through junior high and high school during this time in the mid to late 90s. You know, I felt personally like, you know, at the beginning of the 90s, punk music was mostly like hardcore scene. So it wasn't really my scene. I wasn't really, you know, trying to go out and get mohawks and, you know, leather jackets and spikes. Again, I grew up in North Dakota. If I did that, I would just look like an absolute weirdo. People would be like, what are you doing? You're the only person like this. And I'd be like, yeah, I'm a one-man scene or whatever. But I never really felt like connected to that. And then obviously I still never really got into, you know, hair metal, like glam bands and anything like that. I was like, the music's okay, but like, I don't play dress up. I want to listen to music. I want to play music, but I don't want to look different than I am. And then suddenly, you know, Weezer comes around and it's the first time I ever saw somebody actually play music. You know, grunge was another example. Like Kurt Cobain was the face of grunge, right? Like I thought he was a great writer, great singer, great, you know, musician, but I'm like, I don't do heroin. I'm not like strung out. I don't have any association with the person that Kurt Cobain is. And then I saw Rivers Cuomo and I was like, that guy looks a lot more like me than anybody else I've ever seen play music on MTV before, or, you know, whatever. That's the most normal I've ever seen a person being a lead singer in a band. And all of a sudden I was like, I'm hooked. Like, I love the music, but I also want to play. I knew I could never play guitar like Rivers Cuomo, even though he kind of dials it down on recordings, but he can shred. But I knew I could sing somewhat like him. So I was like, at least I got half of that part so I can play music kind of like Weezer. And that kind of naturally led me to sounding a little bit like Weezer, but still playing in a much more melodic punk fashion. So did you guys see something more approachable about the way Weezer's music and style kind of became that staple in rock music from then on?
I think Rod said some really interesting things about this in the oral history, because if you grew up in LA when hair metal dominated the scene in Los Angeles, I mean, there were still punk bands all over the place. There was still an alternative indie rock scene. But really, hair metal is what people were talking about, the Sunset Strip. So for me, at least, and I'll let Rod definitely chime in on this because he was close to it as well, what Weezer brought to the local scene in terms of the aesthetic and the look was a radical change. But it was a radical change that needed to happen.
Yeah, no, I remember that dividing line for sure. And you know what I was thinking is, you know who turned me on to seeing Weezer live was Sherry. She was friends with PJ, i.e. Johnny Knoxville, who was friends with Pat Wilson. So she was friends in that way with them. And so she dragged me along to a show, maybe 92. I don't remember. It was quite early. But I remember being completely blown away by what I was seeing. I'm like, I don't understand what I'm looking at here. I mean, that is really how I tell people to this day that I had never seen a club band play that well and have undeniable, again, it's subjective whether one likes the songs or the style or the, but to me, as just a guy playing in a, you know, in bands in the scene or whatever, I was like, I can't believe that this is just a club band. It's not, this doesn't make sense. These songs are all like, they're like gold, you know? And also, not only that, but it was such a divide from, it was really the end of the heavy metal. It kind of like put a nail in the coffin of the heavy metal scene. I think at that time, like in the early 90s, things were just trying to find their way, you know, like there was some grungy stuff and some metal, and it was like this soup of just, I don't know what it was. And then Weezer somehow just propelled the music scene in a different direction. And I think like they were like the center of this little world that other bands started revolving around. So that was, I think that's what was so exciting about it at the time, was just to be part of some new thing. And like Steve was saying, all of a sudden you're playing all these cool bills with all these like-minded bands. It seemed to happen really quickly too. You know, I don't remember this like this was a long time. It just like, boom, it just changed.
Well, I mean, it's funny you bring that up, because one of the interesting things about, I mean, I interviewed probably 30, maybe 35 people for this oral history. Mm-hmm. And one of the threads that came up was, it wasn't just that Weezer had success and then people decided to like take little bits of their aesthetic and their songwriting and their approach and their sound. Weezer was actually pretty active in helping people. And I think one of the reasons that the scene accelerated was Weezer left, right? Because they had this success and then they went on the road to sort of like conquer the world beyond LA. That left a sort of gap for bookers booking shows. Weezer, like Matt Sharp and Rivers, literally would take like Justin Fisher from Shufflepuck around and introduce them to bookers and literally say things like, we're leaving, but these guys can start helping you fill up your nights, right? Yeah. And there's this interesting thread of people saying, yeah, Rivers and Matt helped me do this, or Matt helped me do that, or they got us on this bill. Like Weezer got Shufflepuck on early bills, like when they were just starting out, right? They lived together in the Amherst house. They shared a rehearsal space, but like Shufflepuck ended up playing club bills with them, but also like opened for them in Teenage Fan Club at the Universal Amphitheater. They got to open for them at the Palladium. The band before White Owl High was called Lunchbox. Rivers really pushed Kevin to start that band, to the point where they put them on a Weezer show and they didn't have a drummer. So Rivers played drums the first two times that Lunchbox played, just to get his old buddy to start playing. And so there was this like active push from the band members themselves to go like, you guys can do what we did. You can have part of what we built and make it your own. And I think that's pretty cool, because it wasn't like they just like were hands off, good luck. It was like they were helping us.
I think that somehow we just ended up on a lot of these bills. And I'm talking about Supersport and even Magpie before that. And I don't know if it was just that by chance we ended up playing on some of these same bills. I don't recall what it was. Because I know that we, again, just even before Supersport, we were playing shows with them before I knew them at all. So I don't even remember being introduced to any of them for a little bit of time. But I do know that we were playing shows with them before they took off, you know, for tour.
So you're that very first generation that came up alongside them, right? The book talks about these various generations. The first generation that came up alongside them, there were only a handful of bands that they thought they could play with, that they were often booked with. It was Magpie and Supersport 2000. It was Black Market Flowers. It was Thousand Mona Lisas.
Yeah,
it was That Dog. It was Wax.
Yeah, Wax. Oh my gosh, Joyride was another one I forgot about.
Right. So that doesn't surprise me, right? Because it was like at the time, you have to remember, like the biggest bands in LA were like Jane's Addiction and the Red Hot Chili Peppers and Fishbone. So to find like-minded bands like you guys, it doesn't surprise me that you guys kind of started to cluster together and create this nucleus.
And you know, I think what happened was The band that I was in, Magpie, was actually pretty popular. We were playing around a lot, and there was a little bit of buzz around us, and there was buzz around Weezer, and I think that's why we ended up getting booked together, because we were like bands that were doing something, at the time. Not to say that, Magpie was musically very different from Weezer. And so, I don't know, it was just, and that was sort of refreshing too. It just changed my whole, everything when I saw them play. I was like, oh, I guess this is how music can be too. It's very weird to think of how impactful they were. And again, subjectively, one can say they like it or they don't, but they absolutely influenced so many things, pop music after them, period.
Mm-hmm.
Can't deny that. Sorry.
I want to bring up a couple quotes from the book, because there was two quotes, and they're actually back to back, I think, on the same page. But there was a quote in the book from Adam Orth of Shufflepuck, who said, Matt Sharp played a really big role at that time. He says, I'll never forget, probably a day or two after I moved to LA, I had one of those CD wallets with all the albums that I cared about the most. Matt went through it just pulling CDs out and throwing them in the air, going, nope, nope, nope. He was pulling out Stu, Like the Police, and Steely Dan, and saying, not cool, this music sucks. And then similarly, Kevin Rydell of Lunchbox and Rydell High, who grew up in Connecticut with Rivers Cuomo and played in that band Avant Garde that you mentioned, said that Rivers told him, dude, you have to cut your hair. For some reason, Rivers was making everyone cut their hair. I don't know why. I was just like, well, the dude's helping me out. I'll play the game. He said I had to change my look if I was going to hang out with him. Did Weezer literally create their own scene and sort of dictate the marching orders for others to help become like more successful bands?
The intent of those quotes was not to make it seem like they were dictatorial. They weren't at all. You have to remember that Adam Orth and Kevin literally grew up playing metal with these guys, with Rivers in Connecticut. Adam was also part of that Connecticut scene. So these weren't just random other rock bands that they were having these conversations with. They were some of their oldest, closest friends. Yeah. And in both the case of Adam and Kevin, Rivers flew back to Connecticut to convince these guys to move out to LA and get a piece of what he was discovering. Like, he was actively going back and getting his friends to move out, because he's like, I know everybody now. I know how the system works. You guys have got to come out and start playing music. So he was more advocating. But again, you have to remember the change. If you see pictures of Avant Garde, at the end they changed their name to Zoom. And that was even more of cartoonish, playful kind of metal band. From that to the bowl cut and soccer jerseys is 2 years, 2.5 years. That's a pretty radical change to have undergone. And so if you really believe in what you're doing, telling your friends to like be part of that and do the same thing, probably just part of the territory. But no, they weren't out on the street with a bullhorn yelling at strangers that they needed to cut their hair. This was just their friends.
Yeah. It's just pretty impressive that, even as friends, you're telling, like, stop listening to the music, cut your hair. You want to hang out with us, you want to play with us, great, but you can't look like, the long-haired metal glam singers of the 2 years or 6 months ago even, right?
Well, I mean, listen, it might be because of Steve Albini's unfortunate recent passing, but I'm with him on the Steely Dan thing, man. Like, break that CD, stop listening to that. I can't get behind it.
I never did either. I was always like, look, my dad likes Steely Dan. I was like, it exists. It's music, but I don't go around trying to listen to it. I can appreciate good musicians, but I don't have to sit there and listen to everybody who's a good musician.
They were also young guys. You get kind of, there's this culture in rock and roll. You're in your early 20s. You've got this thing going on. You're trying to make a scene. You're like, for Matt and Rivers, if you read what people said in the oral history, they're like not just playing the music and playing the shows and going out flyering every night, but they're sitting around in their living room discussing what Weezer should be. They were like in deep thought about this. So it doesn't surprise me that with their inner circle, they were sharing some of the conclusions that they had come to.
Weezer changes the rock scene forever, and then the Rentals come along and change Weezer forever. So Matt Sharp's side project soon became his full-time band as he recorded and released The Return of the Rentals in the downtime while Rivers Cuomo was enrolled at Harvard and recovering from surgery to lengthen one of his legs that was, shorter than the other from birth. So I got to start with you, Rod, because you kind of part of this home wrecking crew that I would call as the possible, split of Weezer's, maternal, or what would you call that? The matrimony of Matt Sharp and Rivers Cuomo. But you were part of this, right? You actually were part of the Rentals from the start. And that was what was the experience like from your perspective of the split between the Rentals and Weezer? Did it have tension, or was it just kind of at the start, it was just a natural, kind of side project because there was nothing else for the band to do at the time?
I don't think it was ever Matt's intention to be like, I'm splitting off and doing my own solo project. I think Matt just had a bunch of cool songs that he had only recorded, on a cassette tape, because that's what I had originally when he introduced himself to me, because he came up to me after a show and said, hey, do you want to play guitar with me on something? And I said, sure. And then and it was with Pat and him. I think what happened was the original Rentals recordings are very, very raw. And have you heard those, Steve, or like the non-Moog and all that stuff?
Yeah, if you go on YouTube, it's all listed under "That's Incredible," but you can find
I've seen that. So that I think originally the intention was to just record these songs. It just kind of morphed into something. When we first recorded, it was just Pat, Matt, and myself. Then he had Rachel Hayden singing on something, and then he decided to have Sherry sing on it instead. Sherry and I and Matt went down to San Diego to try to get signed from whatever record labels down in San Diego. I can't remember what it was. And they offered him a little bit of money, and he thought about it. And then I don't remember how the Maverick thing got started, but that's what started this whole thing of, and I think, honestly, that's what probably was the catalyst for the split, because it got into heavy politics of like, it wasn't a little record anymore that, Matt was going to put out. It became Maverick Records and a lot of money involved. And I think, and then, they were going to start working on Pinkerton material. And I think there was just a conflict on many levels that drove that split. And I think it's really unfortunate too, because I always thought that Matt was such an, integral part of Weezer in a good way.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of bummed that happened. I was happy to be a part of the Rentals, but I almost didn't foresee that happening, and that whole thing happened very quickly. And I don't know if it was discussed. I think Geffen was also saying, well, we're not sure if we're going to allow, the Rentals record to be put out. That also caused some friction and problems, I think, because they had the right, basically, of refusal to say, no, you can't do that. So I think it just turned into a little bit of an ugly scene there in terms of record labels. I don't know, to tell you the truth, I can't remember personally if there was a discussion that Matt had with his bandmates that was contentious or not. I don't know. I think it was more about the record politics originally that began the split.
It's really a testament to a couple things, though, when I was digging into this. The one, just how readily available major label record deals were in the 90s.
Oh, yeah.
It was at the height of alternative pop punk and all, grunge and all that stuff. It was a lot of people I knew were signing record deals. But more than that is the incredible talent that was concentrated in Weezer, that the bassist, who was not, prior to this, any kind of real songwriter. It was something he was kind of dabbling in. It just so happened that like one of the first songs he wrote was Friends of P, right? Yeah. And that these guys made this scrappy little indie recording, Rod and Pat and Matt. And if you hear it, it is really scrappy. Without it, you think without the synthesizers, well, how much difference can it make? It made a world of difference. It sounds like a different band. Yeah. It sounds like a 4AD band or something from the late 80s, like college rock.
No offense, Rob.
No. Rob was in both versions. Yeah.
I like the 4AD bands, actually.
Yeah. Well, that's one of Matt's big influences as well.
Oh, yeah.
But it's funny that I'm telling Rod this, but it's because I talked to Matt about it. Why they got into a bidding war so fast is because you guys made that Friends of P video where you established that black and white Eastern European look, the sort of dour with the thick glasses and the gray suits. As a goof, somebody sent it to Sony because it started getting played by people. And they thought it was going to be nothing. And Matt said, like 2 days later, they got a phone call. And it's like, Sony wants to sign you guys. And so a bidding war got started. Like, it was that video that really put it over the top.
Yeah. And that, it's so the little background on the video is that I happen to have, I used to, just as a hobby, shoot a lot of 16 millimeter films, like for home movies. And I was still doing it up to just a few years ago where I was just like, this is a hassle. But the reason we made the video too, I think we were just sitting around. I'm like, well, I've got a camera. Let's just shoot this video. And but again, and I think that we didn't know that it was going to be, a popular thing. It was just a scrappy little original raw recording and then a scrappy little video. Of course, the synthesizers went on there, but all these things just started happening very quickly.
Yeah. Now, let me give you kind of a hypothetical scenario as well, because at this same time, or kind of during the same time, basically Matt Sharp found the success with the rentals and eventually did leave Weezer after Pinkerton was released, and they kind of did some stuff with that. But he also kind of ultimately helped Rivers Cuomo make the decision to abandon the space opera album, which was called Songs from the Black Hole. They did rework some of those songs and put them on Pinkerton. But looking back on that project, which, like I said, kind of did later morph into Pinkerton, I think Weezer may have dodged a bullet in the sense that I don't think their world was ready for Songs from the Black Hole at the time. And had they released it, I think it probably would have actually ended Weezer's success at that point. I think it would have kind of killed their popularity. Now, I liked the album. I thought it was really cool. But there is something about it that, like, it's not going to have a mass appeal. It takes that geek rock scene and pushes it to that limit of, like, let's take Star Trek and rock music and kind of put it together, right? Now, I'll get in my reasons why in a second. But what do you guys think about that statement that, like, maybe Weezer, if they would have actually released Songs from a Black Hole, that would have changed their kind of outlook for the rest of the course of their existence?
I feel like Pinkerton being released almost changed the course of their...
That was part of my reason.
And actually, in a lot of ways, it did. Yeah, I mean, the sort of conventional logic is Blue Album launches geek rock or alternative pop, and Pinkerton launches emo, or amplifies bands that were starting to move in that direction as well. It's a very different record, right? They went and did something incredibly experimental after being the Buddy Holly band, and people didn't know what to do with it. Nowadays, it's revered, right? Like, looking back, everybody's like, you know what? That record's pretty great. And you're like, dude, you wrote a scathing review of that record in Rolling Stone. It got savaged. And so that's not that I was close to it or anything, but my understanding is that's why Rivers kind of retreated and ended up going to Harvard and taking that 4 or 5 year break. Is he had poured his heart and soul into this magnum opus, even if it wasn't quite the space opera. It was a huge departure for this band, and the world didn't receive it the way that he envisioned it in his brain.
Yeah.
Right. So, and that's the period where Matt decides to focus on the rentals, because Rivers is gone and he's got the rentals in this contract. So really, that record, even if it didn't get released in the form that you're talking about, did change Weezer's future, right?
Yeah. But incidentally, I agree with you on the Pinkerton thing. I think that also, I know people also to this day who are not really Weezer fans, but they're like, yeah, I like that Pinkerton record though, because it stands alone as its own kind of like pretty undeniably powerful record that's not necessarily geek rock. It's just good songs, And so I think that also, I mean, that was another change.
Yeah.
What I always say about Pinkerton is that it's, Pat Wilson as a drummer is such a secret weapon in Weezer, and I don't think he gets credit for what a great drummer he is. But I feel like Pinkerton is like, that's Pat's record. The drumming is so amazing, and they're recorded so loud and
Yeah.
so big. That when I always just, as a drummer, I always have a huge grin on my face whenever I listen to Pinkerton to these days.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went down to the studio when they were recording that. It was pretty cool. In Van Nuys, was Sound City or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember hearing them tracking, and I was like, "Oh, this is going to be really interesting."
And I still remember to this
Yeah, that was
day,
cool.
the very first time, I think it's El Scorcho, where Pat starts it out with like a do, 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 and just hits the floor tom at the end or the bass drum at the end or something like that. And just like 4 notes on the bass. And you're like, and then like the rest of the album, he's like playing all these technically pretty difficult timings and playing louder, like you said. But like just that part of El Scorcho, I'm like, he's so good at understating his like own value just by doing that as the opening instead of like playing something flashy or flary or having like some actual rock beat intro to the song, because it's basically just like a that's like the whole beat, right? But he starts it out with like these simplistic four drum hits, and you're just like, oh yeah, I can play that. And then you go and try to play the rest of the album, you're like, no, I can't play drums like Pat Wilson apparently.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost ironic though. Like that's that's magic about his drumming is you can see him having a conversation with himself, and like it's almost like he's trying to crack himself up a little bit, like doing the thing that is counter to what he grew up listening to, like Alex Van Halen or something.
Yeah.
I think he was a huge Van Halen fan, but like for him to show that kind of control and restraint, and then but also make it feel like a signature move to just hit 4 notes. That's really something. It's not like something that every drummer could do. And I think that he deserves more credit for sort of being a secret weapon in Weezer.
One of the most impactful things I remember from seeing Weezer play very early on was Pat. And I just remember thinking, besides, the great songs and everything, I actually used to really watch Pat because I was like, that is quite an impressive drummer. And I remember he had this big, like, 22-inch ride or something like that. He was just such an explosive drummer, and so I have a very vivid memory of him as a drummer, and myself not even knowing that much about drums, and I'm like, that is a big part of that band right there.
I was gonna say, I still can't think of a song to this day that starts out with just 4 notes like that, where you're like, immediately you can recognize the song just by the first 4 notes on a drum kit, right? Like, that's El Scorcho. You don't have to play anything past that. I already know that's El Scorcho. So it's just interesting.
I mean, think about the intro to Undone. That's like
right,
a signature drum fill. There's like the simplest drum fill.
Yeah.
And again, it ends on that thuddy floor tom, right?
Yeah. Exactly right. So yeah, that's 2 songs. I mean, it's like he's a riff master on drums that people aren't riff masters, right? He's like, I'm going to make a riff on drums and you're going to hear it and you're going to remember this forever. It's insane.
It does imprint itself.
I'll give you some of my reasons about the space opera, so that way we can talk about this briefly. But one of the reasons I think that if they would have launched that space opera album, Songs from the Black Hole, is not being successful, is Weezer did have a much younger fan base than like grunge bands and even most punk bands at the time. I don't think they would have understood the concept. I think that, like, I was still pretty young when that album came out, Pinkerton. So if they would have released Songs from the Black Hole, I'd have been totally confused as to why they did that. I was somewhat confused by Pinkerton, but I was like, I still like every single song on that album. I was like, this is really incredible. Like, these songs are great. Had they done it as a concept album, I would have been like, what is actually going on? Are they just like completely high on drugs right now? I don't understand this. But I would also say it definitely would have strayed even further from mainstream music, which would have kind of, that alienation period that almost every band has where they put out one album and suddenly like lose half their fan base, right? This, I think, would have lost a lot more than half their fan base. It did change the dynamic of the band. They actually did add other members. I think Rachel Hayden was actually part of the Songs from the Black Hole recording as well. So they actually had 1 or 2 females on the album for that. So then that would have been, another change. Like, now they've got female singers. Now they got synthesizers, which the Rentals obviously did, impart that into their music. I do think it would have been one of those attempts at getting critical praise, which a lot of fans, like, you go make the art house film and then you do the blockbuster movie, right? Blockbuster movie is going to always attract fans, but the art house movies don't. And it's usually like the critics like it, but the fans don't. So I think that would have also kind of, and Pinkerton did have some of that as well. But like you said, it was even critically, like, damaged by like critics, right? But then all that still said, it's a great album, and many of the songs on that Songs from Black Hole in their own right still are great, and like they still exist. Like you can go listen to them. And I think obviously we just said like even that they still released Pinkerton in a kind of more produced, more tightly packaged format, and it still didn't do well as far as like what they kind of expected, right? So I think that while Rivers was upset about Pinkerton not going the way he wanted to, and I actually think this is the biggest shame of all, is that if Pinkerton would have been successful, we would have had like a string of really, 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 really good Weezer albums for like the next 10 years or so before they started going into like some more of the poppy stuff like Beverly Hills and the Make Believe album and some of the other stuff that they've done since then. But let's talk about kind of that gap, because, you know, there was a gap where, like you said, Steve, Weezer went away, right? Weezer actually didn't just go tour. They actually went away after this part, right? So Rivers was gone like 3-4 years. He stopped going to Harvard like what, a semester before graduating, because he was like, I don't want to do it anymore. Just very strange for anyone to do that much work for nothing. But what was it like kind of in that? It's like that would have felt like a lifetime. I feel like Weezer between albums 2 and 3 was like only 4 years, I think, or something like that, maybe 5 years. But it would have felt like a lifetime for people in that scene, because it felt like a lifetime as a fan. I'm like, is Weezer done? Like, how are they only done after 2 albums? What was it like from your guys' perspective being in the scene at the time?
I think I'll speak from my own personal perspective. I think we were all by that point so caught up in what we were doing. Like we were all so focused on making our own music and pursuing our own dreams and our own careers. You know, by 96, Rydell High signed with Joey Cape to my records. So Joey Cape's the lead singer of Lagwagon. He started a small independent label in Santa Barbara that was run by Marco DeSantis out of the bedroom of Marco's mother's house. And they signed Nerf Herder. And then the second band they signed was Rydell High. And so Joey produced our record. It was engineered by Ryan Green from Fat Records. He sort of architected the Fat Records sound. And they put it out, but it was a tiny label. It was just Marco, not to a bunch of fanfare. It came out as a super small indie. Randomly, I got sat next to Rich Egan, who managed Face to Face at that time. I got sat next to him at my friend's wedding and got to talking with him and slid in my demo. And he ended up managing Rydell High. He had just placed Face to Face with A&M Records. And so he got us from my records to A&M Records, re-released the record we made with my records, didn't change a single thing except for the cover.
Yeah.
And that came out on A&M Records. So just a way of showing you with one band, a lot happened for the bands in that scene. Obviously, Nerf Herder took off when Van Halen happened. They jumped from my records to Arista. Baby Lemonade got signed. Campfire Girls got signed to Interscope, and then unfortunately had some serious drug issues in that band, and that didn't really work out. Cockeyed Ghost, I think, signed to Relativity,
right?
To Interscope, and their story is just, because out of the gate, right, like they're this band that's like literally living in the same house and practicing in the same space as Weezer, and they took off and got popular right away. Were able to start headlining shows right away, put out a 7-inch with Where the Hell Is She with a local label. Weezer gave them these profile opening slots at the Palladium and Universal Amphitheater. I mean, think about that bill. Shufflepuck, Teenage Fan Club, and Weezer in 95. I mean, that's like what a bill to be on. They made a huge record, and it is a fantastic sounding record. But Interscope, the label they were signed to, was so big at that time and was putting out so many hits that they didn't have room to promote a baby band, which is what they were considered, a new unproven act. And so because they had all this attention from other labels, Adam went to the Interscope heads and said, I can't do this anymore. Will you just drop me and give me the record back? And Interscope said, okay, we understand. You're getting frustrated. Well, by the time they did that, the moment had passed for signing geek rock bands, and then Shufflepuck couldn't replace that record and ended up breaking up on stage at a club show in Hollywood. So their ride was like really indicative of sort of like how meteoric it could be, but then what the reality is. Not everybody gets to be Weezer. Not everybody gets to be the Reynolds.
My answer to that was immediately we got swept into the rentals thing. And then when that lasted, not too long, but however, we went off to record the second record. And then my band Supersport was playing around. And then right after that, I started recording and producing a lot. So I don't even remember missing Weezer around. Like I felt like that whole scene just passed already. Like we're just on to the next thing.
Yeah.
And I don't even really remember the club scene much after that. I think things just started moving quickly past the Weezer influence in terms of them playing shows around and stuff. That was just like this little golden moment.
Yeah.
It was an interesting moment though in LA at that time because there was a booker named Larry Mann, and Larry was the one who booked Weezer for their first show, closing for Dogstar. They got to play it like at 1 o'clock in the morning at Raji's after Dogstar. That was Weezer's first show. Larry with Tony Perkins ended up starting a festival called Poptopia. And that was several clubs a night across a week where they would book all pop bands. That to give you an idea of just how many pop rock bands were playing in LA at the time, this guy could start a festival just in LA and have like 4, 5, 6 clubs a night, stacked 7 bands deep for a whole week. And so it was a really big and vibrant scene. And then that eventually collapsed. Poptopia did. And then after that, International Pop Overthrow started on the heels of Poptopia by David Bash. And actually that's still around today. And David Bash is celebrating his 25th anniversary. So the scene was big and it was vibrant and there were a lot of bands, enough that it could support 2 festivals just in Los Angeles.
Yeah. And obviously right after, kind of in that same time that Weezer was on a break, that's when, pop punk kind of became the next big music wave, right? So like Green Day started it kind of right about 95, but Blink-182 kind of blew it off of its hinges around 99, 2000. And then that became a whole different scene from 2000 to 2008 or so, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it's just interesting how when one thing disappears, just all this other stuff comes in and fills that gap.
Yeah, none of us saw new metal come in, man. That really nailed the coffin lid shut.
Let's talk about the actual project, though. Let's dig a little bit more onto the Generation Blue book, the Generation Blue project book and vinyl stuff. So, what was the idea behind it, Steve? Because the one thing you do, and I've read 2 of your books now, it's not just you writing and then quoting somebody, right? It's you actually kind of writing a little bit of kind of an intro and then letting everybody else kind of tell it from their own perspective. So you just have people, that you've interviewed, just them saying what their experience was. So what was your experience? Obviously, this isn't your first rodeo, right? But why did this one come to, the Generation Blue project, and why did you start this one?
I saw Weezer in 2019 at a big LA alternative rock festival. And I was there with like Justin from Soma and Shufflepuck, and I think Adam Orth showed up backstage and whatever. I ran into some old friends, but I remember standing in Marco was there. Marco from Popsicle and Sugar Cult was there with me, as a matter of fact. And I remember standing in the crowd that night watching Weezer play, and I'd kept up with them, but I just something clicked for me that night when they were just playing hit after hit after hit. And it was a greatest hits show, right? And people in their 40s and 50s were standing there with their teenage and adult kids, and they were both screaming the lyrics back. It was like 20,000 people screaming the lyrics back at Weezer. And it clicked with me that I hadn't given them credit for what a huge influence they had. And that it struck me that back in 94, nobody could have predicted that 30 years later, they would still be mainstream alternative rock hit makers, right? It just seemed improbable. And so I kind of socialized it that night. I said, did you see what I just saw? That like Weezer's got like 10, 12, 14, 15 hits deep, right? Like they just keep releasing hits. And as we talked about it more, I was like, man, it'd be really interesting to sort of dive into the influence they had. And so that was the initial impetus. I paired that with a memory I had of Rydell High opening some West Coast shows for Weezer during the Pinkerton era. And we drove into Seattle for the first show. We played with them. And it was like before sound check for like 2:00 in the afternoon. There was already 100 or 150 kids lined up outside, and they were kids. They were like 11, 12, 13 years old. Every fifth one had an acoustic guitar, and they were all sitting there strumming and singing Weezer songs together. And I was like, there's something different about the way this band is landing with fans of this music. Like they're in, and they want to emulate it, and they want to be part of it. They're not just passively listening. They want to be part of something. And so I combined those memories, and I started thinking about a geek rock book. I started thinking about like a book that was sort of like, Weezer doesn't get enough credit for what an influence they've had on alternative rock. And then I got COVID for the first time, which, everybody got COVID for the first time. And I'm a little too high energy to just lay in bed for 7 or 8 days and be quarantined. So this idea I had turned into me randomly emailing people and going, look, dude, I'm laid up. I need people to talk to. Can I interview you for 45 minutes about what happened in Hollywood in the 90s? And that really is when it turned the corner. Once I had 20 or 25 interviews and saw the incredible stories and the overlap and the perspective that everybody had, I was like, I don't need to write this book. It should just be an oral history because there's a lot of really interesting information here.
Was there any particular memory or quote from somebody that while you were interviewing, or maybe Rod, that you remember from somebody that was just like stood out as something somebody said to you that was like, you know what, like that's kind of this scene in a nutshell, or that's how I kind of remember it, or this is why this has a lasting impact, or anything like that?
I mean, for me, I think it's probably Adam Marsland from the band Cockeyed Ghost. He was in a band with Justin Fisher, who was in Shufflepuck and later in Soma. Justin is sort of the Zelig of geek rock. He's sort of been in every band, and he's been there from the beginning, and he's still there now. He was playing with Adam Marsland. They were rehearsing in the garage with Weezer. They were the other band early on that rehearsed in the garage, the Adam Marsland band. But Adam was from this like 70s AM radio Beach Boys vibe. He didn't really get alternative rock. And Weezer got signed. And he came out of the rehearsal studio one day, and Rivers was sitting on the couch in the living room because they were just hanging out. They were friends. And Adam said, Rivers, can you please tell me what I'm doing wrong? And then incredibly, Rivers did. He sat him down and he explained the way that he thought about Weezer and how he thought that could apply to Adam. And that talk, followed by a mixtape that Rivers literally gave him to understand modern music, was the foundation for the band Cockeyed Ghost. So I love the connectivity. It's like a story like that just tells you what a profound influence they had personally on Adam Marsland, but just what an impact they had on the LA bands who were like, what am I doing wrong?
Yeah,
I'll tell you what you're doing wrong. And he told him. It's just incredible.
The other thing was, what I remember was the excitement of like Matt saying like, hey, you want to play guitar on this record? I was like, huh? I really like this band Weezer. You know what I mean? I was like, imagine if that had happened to one of you guys. It doesn't have to be Weezer. Just think of any band that, I'm just saying, any person who's approached by a band that they're really admiring, and one of the guys is like, hey, you want to play with me? That was really like a highlight of that time for me, is just being like looking around like, me? Like, oh, sure,
No, Matt, I don't want to play guitar in your band. Go away.
I have to say, I was kind of like, I wasn't quite sure why he singled me out. To this day, I'm not really certain. I think we just kind of admired each other as fellow musicians. That was really a very, tender memory for me, is just being like swept up into that.
Yeah,
I remember running into you guys backstage at a weenie roast or acoustic Christmas.
Yeah, sure.
And talking to you and Mike, the drummer Mike, backstage. Yeah. And you guys kind of had expressing that to me, like, how did we end up here?
It's really bizarre because, again, imagine being musicians like you and I, Steve, and seeing a band like Weezer and being like pretty blown away, and literally, a few months later, somebody saying like, oh, by the way, do you want to play in my project? It was just like, huh? and then it turning into the thing that the rentals turned into. It to this day, it almost feels like a dream sequence, you know, because it's so long ago now, and I feel very fortunate to have been part of that whole experience, from seeing Weezer play, from being part of that scene, from going and being part of the rentals, to then working later on, you know, Maladroit, and still being, Pat Wilson is still one of my best friends, you know, just like, it's just been a really nice journey in life, you know, and it hasn't been all music. It's just resulted in friendships. Ironically, I don't really talk to Matt anymore. There's no reason why. We just don't, you know, once in a while we'll send each other an email or something like that.
Like I said, every band from that era that put out music, I was like, I didn't know about most of them, but because of the Generation Blue project. Now I know about, I heard of Shuffle Puck. I never heard of any of their songs because I lived in rural North Dakota. I only heard the band because I think I saw it on flyers or announcements from Weezer at the time. Like, they were playing these shows with these bands. And I'm like, I'll never hear that band because I don't have a CD. I don't have a record that I can play of theirs. And you just don't get that opportunity anywhere else in the world. So like, I'd heard of some of these bands. I remember, Wax from the Mallrats soundtrack and the song California, but never knew that Joe Sib, who then started Side One Records, that became Side One Dummy Records. I didn't know that he was the lead singer of that band. There's so many of these interwoven stories that makes this book and this project so integral for knowing and liking this music. If you like it, you're going to really enjoy everything about it. I was hooked. Like, I read like 30 pages in like the first like hour or whatever, I don't know, 40 minutes that you sent it over to me. I was like, it's amazing. Like, this is all great.
One of the most beautiful, there's been some really beautiful things that have happened because of this project. Not just that I got to put the book together and the comp together and get to hold it in my hand and bring it out in the world, but it's reconnected me with people like Rod. It's reconnected me with people like Jason Cropper. Matt Sharp and I were very close in the 90s and into the early 2000s when I was playing drums in a band called Czar. And we had kind of fallen out of touch, but this has put us back in touch. Put me back in touch with Daniel and Jose from Ozma, who I had not spoken with in a long time. And then Shuffle Puck reunited and played the launch party. It was their first show since that night they broke up on stage 27 years ago. Those guys reunited and played. I got to play with Kevin Rydell. Unfortunately, we lost our third band member, Steve Leroy, a few years ago. And so sadly, he wasn't able to be part of it. But Marco stepped in and played with us, and Jose from Ozma stepped in and played with us, and Matt Fuller, who was most recently in Puddle of Mud, played with us. I mean, it's a testament to Steve Leroy that we had to get 3 other guys to fill his one spot.
Yeah.
But there's just been all these serendipitous, beautiful moments that have come out of it. And I feel like there's some forward momentum just in terms of my personal relationships that go beyond this project now. Like, I feel like I can reach out to Rod and we could send emojis or emails to each other, and it's not just about the project.
Yeah.
But we went through a thing together, and we got to celebrate it, and I just think that's kind of beautiful.
Obviously, we haven't even scratched the surface on the book. I mean, there's so much more stuff in the book that you can read. You can see all the connections. We'll obviously leave a link in the description below, so go check out the vinyl, go check out the comp, go check out the book, buy them. That's what I'm going to do. As soon as we actually get off this, I'm probably going to buy it. I do want to talk a little bit more about the lasting legacy of the geek rock scene. The landscape of rock music seemed to change drastically in the 90s. Obviously we talked about going from hair metal, glam bands, all the way through grunge, all the way through the Weezer kind of geek scene, to pop punk, right? So every few years it was just drastically changing. But it sort of seems like the last 20 years or so, really nothing's grown organically like any of those genres grew up in that time period, right? I mean, we did talk about nu metal as well, kind of at the end of the 90s and early 2000s. You haven't seen something like that kind of crop up since then, right? Like, that was like 15 years of just like monumental changes right after the other. And the last 20 years, there really hasn't been anything. So, obviously there's a couple of exceptions, maybe like 21 Pilots or something like that, kind of doing their own thing in their own way. But from your guys' perspective, does it seem like 90s almost took rock music towards the end of its creative limit and sort of screwed everyone else after that?
I read a lot about this because I still write about new bands at my Substack newsletter, Remember the Lightning. And so I'm really interested in how all of this progressed from the 90s till now. And I think the big things that get pointed to by people who are much smarter than me is the rise of technology, right? So technology definitely changed a lot of things, most notably, and especially as it comes to the way that rock had previously dominated culture in a lot of ways, is monoculture is gone, right? Everything is super fragmented. And for the 30 or 40 or 50 years that rock was dominant, I guess it would be 30 or 40 from the British invasion up until the late 90s, early 2000s, it was monoculture that really drove rock and kept it front and center and top of mind for everybody. I think people did burn out on rock to a certain degree. I think it definitely it hit a commercial peak, and at a certain point, even though it was at its roots supposed to be rebellious against mainstream culture, it itself had subsumed mainstream culture. Exactly. So that left other forms of music being able to rebel against rock music itself. And of course, hip hop just took off and is still dominant to these days. You also have the rise of technology and producer music, which gave rise to modern pop music, right? Where the producer in the studio is almost a bigger player than the artist, which is an inverse of what rock and roll had always been. But I see the influences of Weezer when I talk to a lot of bands or I see bands live, that there's still this thread of the aesthetic that shows up. There's still this thread of, we're going to play alternative pop music, but we're also going to have some shredding guitar in there. Because again, Rivers was always inserting a little bit of shredding guitar. He's an amazing guitarist, right? And he does have that heavy metal background. I see that in a lot of the music that I encounter these days from younger or newer bands. And the look, right? There's still this, like, I remember Justin from Shufflepuck and Soma and I went to see some young bands play at this place called the Roadhouse here in LA. And he leaned over to me at one point and he's like, "Did we do that?" And I was like, "What?" And he said, "The guys up on stage right now look like they just clocked out at work and then grabbed instruments and walked up on stage." And I said, we definitely did some of that, but I think you got to give the credit to Weezer, right? Yeah. And, fairness to Weezer, they really got that from the Pixies or Pavement. There were other bands that were doing it. Weezer just had the perfect package of this mainstream marketable thing that got talked about as geek rock. But I think you can see their influence everywhere these days.
Yeah, I think that what I have noticed that's changed about music is the ability of every band to just go and record themselves. There's, that's one of the reasons I was doing a lot of recording and producing of a lot of LA bands, Silver Sun Pickups, for example, was one among 30 bands that I was just nonstop recording and producing and doing things. I started hearing bands that were doing their own recordings, and that was an impetus for me to say, you know what? I really don't need to do this anymore because these bands are getting better at it than I am. I don't know if that's getting away from your question, Isaac, but it is a very important change in the whole rock and indie, especially indie music scene, that bands have gotten very good at knowing how to create pretty good recordings. I know, again, that's a very subjective thing. You can listen to, let's say, Sirius XMU and hear the whole palette of indie music, and you could say it doesn't sound good, but I have to say a lot of the music sounds pretty good. And a lot of the bands, I know some of them are being produced, by a handful of producers that are great recording engineers, but I think kids are pretty savvy about recording now, and you don't have to go get a budget and record in a studio, And that in itself has just changed what music can be and do.
I think there's some pros and cons of that too, because, you get the ability to be totally creatively free, right? So you get all the freedom you want to make your own kind of music. There is a bit of a downside there that I'll speak for the bands that I know personally. Almost all the bands that I know personally, instead of saying, okay, let's, create 30 songs, whittle it down to 10 for an album, they're like, now that we can record our own songs, we release every single song as we record them, which kind of leaves you to go, that probably shouldn't be a song that you release, right? Because that one's not as good as your last 3 or 4. Like you can shelve some songs. You don't have to just release a new song just because you wrote it, right? I think there is a pro and con there, because there is some of that, like, I know for a fact that Rivers Cuomo would write a song a day, if not more than a song a day, for like 4 or 5 years straight. So that guy probably had 300-400 songs that he went into, the Green Album, for example, or 200 songs for Maladroit that he whittled down to 16. And you're like, that's impossible. How do you even do that? But I'm not even talking about doing that kind of volume. I'm just saying, like, be savvy about it in the sense that, if you really think you got 10 incredible songs, release those. But if you have 15 songs and 5 of them are just okay, maybe save the 5 songs, don't release them, right? So there is some sort of things that a producer will tell you when you go sit into a recording studio, and they'll say, I don't think that one fits. And then obviously the artist is going to go, why? It's a great song. We love it. Like, we want to re-record it. But then he'll, that person will say, here's the kind of concept of why this is an album and why it's not, and here's maybe why it doesn't fit. So there's pros and cons there, but at the same time, you're right. A total creative freedom, but also a lack of outside experience, kind of mentoring the ability to kind of package it in a way that might make them more successful, I think is a reason why you don't see a band kind of catapulting from nothing these days as fast.
That's absolutely right. I think there's just so much music now, and a lot of the indie stuff that I hear that's on the radio I feel like it is a product of, like, okay, we just released this, and it's kind of mediocre, and it's becoming, I don't know, and that's what makes something like, the Blue Album so special too, is because, it had a very specific production on it that influenced the sound. One of my other good friends is Joe Santiago in the Pixies, and we just were talking last week when Steve Albini passed away. I don't know if you guys were privy to the negative comments that Steve Albini had made about the Pixies record. Yeah. And I was literally just talking to Joe about that about 2 weeks before Steve Albini died. And then I said, well, what do you think now? And he said, he started to tell me of how he thought Steve Albini made Surfer Rosa a great record, in the way that Steve was supportive of things that Joe had the idea of doing, that even he himself was like, no, this idea is terrible. This isn't going to sound good. And Steve would say, you know what, let's try to do that. And I think that's a testament to a producer and what they can create for you, because you never know that if you really are just doing it yourself, you may try to do what you thought you were going to do and not quite do it. I think the guidance is helpful.
Yeah.
And production, and I'm not saying that indie bands today, and I'm using the term indie just loosely, or rock bands are not produced. I'm saying a lot of them are produced, but a lot of it is not. And I think it lends itself to what you were saying, Isaac, where I think you may maybe start to lose perspective a little bit of what you're really doing.
Yeah.
And that goes beyond the songwriting. I mean, it goes into the production, into everything, even your vocal performance.
I remember back in the 90s.
I don't think the Blue record sounds like the Blue record without Rick Ocasek.
Yeah,
like,
right.
I think he played a really big role in the way that record sounds. And I think that it was such an important role that I don't think you could replicate it.
Yeah.
It was a moment. They had these amazing songs, this super talented band, and a producer who knew how to get the best out of them and knew when to get out of the way and let them do their own thing. And it was just alchemy. It was magic.
Not only that, but just the sound of the record, because at that time in the early to mid 90s, people like to use reverb on records, on vocals, drums. When I heard that record, I was like, what? It was so dry. But that's part of what makes it unique, and that is 100% of something a producer did.
From the Blue record, and probably of all time, Say It Ain't So is probably my favorite Weezer record from the Blue record. But the second, and really close second, possibly tied, is Jamie from the DGC Rarities. I love that song so much.
Yeah, and they used to play that live. I remember that was one of the songs that I was like, thought was a great song live. Had a lot of energy.
And it's one of the only ones that actually has Jason Cropper playing guitar on it.
Yeah, and you know, this is a very weird thing, but I was flipping around Sirius XMU recently, and Jamie was on the radio. And I was like, why is this getting played? And it was on Lithium.
Mm.
And it ended up that it was, the DJ was, what's the name of the Maroon 5 singer?
Adam.
Yeah,
Levine?
yeah. Levine. He was the one that was playing it, and he talked about it afterwards as such an influential song. That was something I did not see coming. So
very interesting.
But he was singled that song out as saying like, this song is incredible, you know, and it was one of the songs that influenced me heavily.
Well, I mean, he was in Kara's Flowers, right, which was a scene that the band on the scene in LA that, like, along with like Phantom Planet and Ozma and
oh yeah, right, mm-hmm.
kind of took that Weezer template. They were like the third generation.
But I will say that there was something about in the 90s where you actually went into a studio to record because you didn't have recording equipment at your house. You had a professional recording, you had to go. I went to a studio in 2001. Like, I recorded an album in 2001 in a studio. You had to practice. You had to practice the shit out of the songs that you played. So that way, when you went into the studio, you didn't burn up a bunch of your budget on a guy's hours of recording and producing the album, right? So not only that, you had to play the songs in front of people to know if they were any good. Nowadays, you literally could go into the studio in your garage or wherever you have it, and like I have it in my room right here, and write a song. Never played it in front of anybody. No idea if it's any good. No idea if anybody's going to receive it well, and put it up on Spotify and just fingers crossed that the algorithm kind of takes it right. I don't think there's anything like practicing the shit out of a song, playing it in front of people, knowing it's getting a reaction, and then going into a studio, doing it right, and then actually releasing it the right way. I think a lot of bands kind of need to hear that. Again, you helped produce Maladroit. What was it like doing that project with Weezer?
My role as a producer, I would say, was producer light. Because really how I ended up on that record was because Rachel Hayden was touring with Jimmy Eat World, and Jimmy Eat World was playing with Weezer. And Rachel was talking with Rivers one day, and she said, you know, he was saying, you know, I just want to, I need to find a producer for this next record, and I just want to like go into hiding and do it, you know, in a, you know, under the radar. I don't want a big producer. And she just happened to say, why don't you hire Rod to do it? She said his reaction was like, that's a good idea. And he just called me up and said, do you want to produce this record? But it was really, what I think he really wanted me to do was just kind of sit in the studio with them, hang out, listen to things, say, hey, what do you think of that? Does that sound good? I was not somebody making decisions in the studio. He had me along. I think I ended up, that's when Pat and I started sort of reconnecting, and we became almost inseparable for a few years after that. We were just hanging out all the time and having fun. And I think that record, it was chaotic. The production, I think Rivers was trying to figure out how to produce it. He said, okay, let's maybe have Rod have some input. Okay, that's a good idea. Rod, can you sit in with Brian's guitar recording? And, you know, I helped steer Brian a little bit in some things maybe. And Brian was pretty receptive to saying, you know, what do you think of this? But it wasn't, there was no heavy duty production. But interestingly, what did come of that was Rivers put me on the AM radio session and had me work with Kevin for a while, because that was an example of Rivers saying, I really want AM radio to succeed. Rod, can you go work with them? I want you to still come in. I was so busy at that time because I was going in the studio with Weezer, but also then in the evenings I would go and work with AM radio. And that was something that he had me produce. And frankly, I think that recording that I did with them came out really, really good. I was like the utility, I guess the baseball analogy is I was like the guy on the bench who's like, hey, can you just come and pinch hit here and do this? Yeah. And it was a really wonderful experience, actually. And I got to go to Japan and work on a single that I did help produce, the Keep Fishing single. And I got to play a little piano on that. I had an idea for it that I thought was kind of cool.
Yeah.
And so
that was the one that ended up being the Muppets in the video, right?
Yeah. That was a
Yeah.
funny. I went to that video shoot too.
Yeah. Obviously, it's been 30 years since the Blue Album, but what have you seen as like the biggest contributions to what I would call modern rock that came from the geek rock explosion in the 90s? What are just some of like the biggest things that you've seen?
I go back to what I saw with those kids outside the venue in Seattle, that something about Weezer made people think that they could do it.
Yeah.
It really had an identifiable indie spirit that didn't make you think that you had to be a virtuoso, didn't make you think that you had to have perfect cheekbones or the right haircut, that you could simply just go out and play music because you loved music. And I think that's a really enduring legacy. They weren't the only band that did that. Plenty of other indie bands did that, but something about Weezer connected with this certain type of fan. And I think it spurred a lot of people to take up playing music. And I think that's a really important part of their legacy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think Weezer kind of came off, especially with their image in the Blue Album, as the regular guy.
Yeah.
The inwardly drawn kid. And I think to this day, it resonates, with kids, people that would be kids of our age, Steve, you know what I mean? Like little kids. I have friends that have kids that say, I didn't know that you knew Weezer or you were in the Rentals or whatever. They get so excited, not because they were a popular pop band necessarily, but also just because of what they stand for, It just still resonates today, I think. And like you said, Steve, they're not the only band that have done that, but they have that quality about them that to this day, it was just left an indelible mark in like musicians who want to do something and can think, if they did it, I can do it,
And that was actually the first time I remember when I picked up a guitar, I was 11. So it was right around the time when Blue Album came out. I never really, I knew I always wanted to try to sing, but I absolutely could not sing and play guitar at the same time. I was like an impossible thing. I was like, there's no way this is possible. How do people do this? It can't be done. And then when I saw Weezer, playing and singing, I was like, oh, I knew that the band was actually quite talented. They made it look very easy. So, but I was like, the fact that they made it look very easy made me believe that I could sing and play. And it was within probably 14 months after the Blue Album that I started writing songs where I could sing and play, when I previously thought that it was an impossibility to be able to do that because I could barely remember how to keep the chords in order, right? But then I was like, doing that without thinking about it and then singing, that seems like magic. And then when you actually unlock that ability, you're like, I think I'm kind of doing something magical here. Even if your music sucks, you feel like you're doing something magical because you're doing something that for most anybody on planet Earth, playing guitar is hard enough. Playing and singing is taking it to another level of difficulty, right? And just seeing that from the Blue Album, I was like I get that like Nirvana didn't have overly complicated songs. You can't match Kurt Cobain's voice, though. It's very difficult to have that voice. I could easily sing in Rivers Cuomo's register and tone, and even though he has some falsetto, or Matt Sharp throws in some falsetto in the background, it was easy to kind of stay in there. Whereas before, rock music was high-pitched singers, Steve Perry, even some of the Metallica, not necessarily Metallica, but like they had the gruff voice. Everybody had to have their own kind of signature voice. Whereas now you could just sing however you wanted to sing in a register and play at the same time, which, opened a whole different version of modern rock music to me that, was the reason why I started playing and singing in the first place. And, I have to tell my friend Ryan that he's an absolute jackass, and we just proved over the course of an hour and a half why he's a jackass. So I appreciate you guys for being on here and helping me prove my point that, I have dumb friends and sometimes they say stupid shit that I got to call them out on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought it all the way back around. Like, I didn't even remember that's where we started, but you brought us all the way back around to just shove it in Ryan's face. So well done, Isaac. But all joking aside, thank you so much for having us on. This is a really fun conversation. I had no idea that we had been talking that long, which is a really good sign.
Yeah, I'll snip it all out and it'll be 15 minutes at the end of this. But yeah, no, I'm just kidding.
Just leave Rod in. Do us all a favor.
It's been really fun to re-explore again. Like Steve, thanks for, including me and all that, because it was just kind of like, it was nice to remember all those things that, who knows, I may have gone many years without really not thinking about it that much anymore, except, reminiscing with Pat or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't imagine doing it without you. I mean, I feel like looking back, I needed every voice that I got, and it took a lot of work and a lot of time, but it was worth it because I think it's a complete story. I think you get a real sense of what was happening. So thank you.
Yeah, and like I said, go to the show notes below this episode. Make sure you click on that link to go check out the book, the vinyl. At least check out the vinyl compilation or the compilation on Spotify if you have no other, money or effort or whatever. Go listen to the music because you're going to be blown away. There is a Shuffle Puck song on there. That Dog, Rydell High, I think are all on there. There's Supersport 2000. There's so many good bands on there. The compilation does not include Weezer or the rentals, but your Spotify playlist that you sent me did, which kind of tied it all together. It was just like a really good way to like weave the paths all together, and I was like, this is incredible. So check all that stuff out. And guys, I appreciate your time, and I'll leave you guys to it, but thank you so much for being on today. That's the show for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you learned anything or liked what you heard on the show today, please show us some support and subscribe to this channel, and like, comment, and share this video with a friend or put it up on social media. I hate to keep asking, but without those small actions, the YouTube bots pretty much ignore this channel. Putting these videos out is a lot of work, and if you want to show your appreciation, please consider purchasing some of our musical accessories or merch from our store at poweredbyrock.com. You can read our blog and follow us in the links below as well. Those are the plugs, and that's all I have. I'll see you soon for the next episode. Until then, rock on.